Hello, Politics Plus Media 101 listeners. Mr. John Gunnison and I come to you today discussing a topic that neither of us are happy to get into, but something we believe is imperative due to the existential threat that American democracy is facing. We are going to discuss the debate last week between President Biden and former president, convicted felon, Donald J. Trump. Ultimately, we're going to be looking at what happened and whether or not Mr. Biden should step aside and not run for re-election. So, John, President Biden has been masterful if you're looking at his legislative accomplishments, especially relative to former President Trump when it comes to international relations, strengthening Ukraine, dealing with other crises around the world. Personally, I would give the current president a pretty darn solid grade when it comes to policy. My concern, though, is I assume you also agree. Last night's debate was extremely concerning, but also nothing new. And my takeaway is that President Biden needs to step aside and not run for re-election.
To your point, we did not think that we were going to do a program discussing the debate. We didn't think there was going to be anything too new or too newsy. But I think that what we did see at the debate was something that was important and was something that really was new in a way. And I think it was new to a matter of degree. Like you've implied, there's been a concern among the general public and in many quarters of the media that President Biden is too old to serve another 4-year term. It's become the trait, the feature that is most associated with President Biden. If you asked people in a focus group to give one or two words to describe President Biden, the first thing all of them would say, I'm sure, is old. We've also seen him, for example, at the State of the Union address, looking pretty alert, pretty energetic. We haven't seen enough of it, though. And what we saw on Thursday at the debate, I think, was really the nadir. We saw him age to a degree that we really hadn't seen. And it made us wonder, I think, more and more what he's like behind the scenes, what he's like in the room with his staff, what the staff know about his current aptitude that they haven't been sharing with the public. We know that they've been permitting far fewer interviews than other presidents have. We know that he's done quite a small number of press conferences compared to other presidents during his time in office. We know that we haven't seen that much of him on the campaign trail. And it's really raising the question of what his current state is when it comes to the decline that all of us are going to experience as we get older. And it's an important enough moment, I think, that we are going to have a long conversation about this. And I think that we're on a similar page as to our conclusion. And you mentioned that it's a difficult topic and a somber topic and all of that. But at the same time, it's also a subject that opens interesting possibilities and perhaps some optimistic possibilities. It might be this sort of kick in their pants that the Democratic Party and Biden himself need to really make a change. And the prospect of having a new candidate, a new nominee, is something that I think is sort of energizing for the Democrats and for the general anti-Trump movement. And in some ways, it's almost a little bit exciting to think about what that could actually look like. And if more people start looking at it from that point of view, maybe it makes it more likely that something is actually going to move. Now, I want to address the other point that you made about Biden's current legacy. And I agree with you that he's been a very successful president in the 3.5 years that he served, I think especially on domestic policy. And I think really working with Congress and getting major pieces of legislation passed is really the thing that's been most impressive. I also think the economic management has been generally pretty impressive considering the circumstances, comparing us to peers. I think a lot of that goes to the Fed chairman and Secretary of the Treasury as well. A lot of that credit. On foreign affairs is maybe where you're actually going to see some more criticisms. His handling of the war in the Middle East, I think, is something that is not going to be highly regarded by many analysts or historians. But I certainly agree with you that in the first year after the escalation in Ukraine, we saw very impressive management of key alliances with Europe and with East Asia. So I think it's a pretty good legacy overall, a legacy that stacks up well against other presidents that we've had since the end of the Cold War. There is this mindset that in order to have a positive legacy, you have to serve 2 terms. we've sort of become prisoners of the two-term term limit in the way that we think about presidential success. It's almost a paradox that the term limit, which is supposed to restrain the amount of time in office that presidents serve, has in fact encouraged them all to seek the full 8 years, when otherwise it might be a much more ordinary decision to retire after one. If Biden were to retire after one term, his legacy, I think, would be quite positive, similar to other presidents that have left a pretty great legacy after a single term, including President George Bush or someone like James K. Polk, who really achieved an incredible amount in one term. And I think that the possibility of achieving a lot in one term is something that more of our political figures should be considering as an option.
Two things I do want to kind of clarify. We are not calling for Biden to drop out because we like doing a podcast and we think it will be exciting. When you say exciting, what you mean is it would re-energize the Democratic base, independent voters potentially, by replacing a geriatric old man who 72% of all voters, according to a recent CBS poll, believe is incompetent to do the job, with somebody much younger who would be able to hit the trail with energy, with vigor and force, and move forward in a new direction. The second argument that I see, and this is why we started with his legacy and how impressive it is, we see people conflating. A lot of these people are using motivated reasoning because they have skin in the game, perhaps. But we see people conflating the job of doing president with the job of running for president. And yes, there are similarities, right? If you're doing the job of president, you need to be able to communicate well, when running for the job is all about communications. So just because he can be competent doing the legislative work that he has done, policy does not determine elections since I've been working in politics, and certainly will not determine this election. If you stack President Trump's policy record up against President Biden's policy record, the polls wouldn't be showing President Trump winning the election. So there are differences between doing the job and running for the job.
Able to make every single solitary person eligible for what I've been able to do with the COVID. Excuse me, with dealing with everything we have to do with. Look, if we finally beat Medicare.
Thank you, President Biden. President Trump?
Well, he's right. He did beat Medicare. He beat it to death.
I just wanted to use two examples of the debate and why it was so disastrous. The first example is President Biden saying we defeated Medicare. Not only does that not make sense, it is completely opposite of the messaging the campaign has been trying to drive home, which is President Biden will defend Medicare and Medicaid and these programs when Trump is the threat. So that is point one. If you're not able to land a point coherently about the social safety net programs that your party has created and stood for 50, 60 years, that's a big problem. The second issue, John, in this debate is that when discussing abortion, this was, again, early on. So we can't say he was exhausted from 90 minutes of debating. The way that President Biden approached abortion was not to give massive and vitriolic and appropriate condemnation for the work that President Trump, the Federalist Society, the Republicans, the Tea Party, the House Freedom Caucus have done for decades to stack the Supreme Court and overturn Roe v. Wade. It was not to focus on really extreme draconian laws in Republican states that are going to primarily impact and negatively impact underserved communities who will be forced to cross state lines to get an abortion. Maybe they can't afford to do that, for example. It was not to give personal anecdotes from people that the abortion decision has already hurt massively. What did President Biden do? He pivoted to an illegal immigrant murdering a U.S. citizen. So he took the one policy issue that is unequivocally a pillar of the campaign and a strength for the Democrats, and he flipped it to the weakest, or one of the weakest, two issues in the campaign, and he put a spotlight on it himself. Former President Trump didn't need to do really any work there. President Biden was undermining himself and the entire campaign strategy in that answer. And that really brings us to why this debate was so concerning. We have a campaign that is founded on opposing Donald Trump because Donald Trump is incompetent to do the job and a threat to democracy. Unfortunately, what the debate did was it muddied that argument because President Biden, quite frankly, was so incompetent that what he did was he reinforced that age narrative in a way where now the CBS poll that I'm referring to, 72% of voters believe that President Biden is incompetent to do the job, while 49% of voters believe President Trump is incompetent to do the job. So if your entire message is we must defend democracy, and I am the candidate to do so, and that message is something that inherently does not immediately resonate with the low information swing voters that will determine this election, you need to be able to present a clear juxtaposition between the Democratic candidate and the Republican candidate, which very clearly President Biden is not able to do because he's not able to communicate.
Yeah, Justin, I agree with a lot of the points you're making. I want to add a few more things. So first, I just want to start off by talking about the language and vocabulary that we're using as we're having this discussion. So Joe Biden dropping out of the campaign. Of course, that is certainly one way of describing what would happen. But I think another way of talking about this, something that I've actually noticed that more media figures are using, some different language, is to talk about retirement. Joe Biden retiring from his political career. And I think that this is a more graceful, dignified, and generous way to talk about what I think is necessary. And when you frame it in those terms, and you talk about retirement, it becomes so natural and appropriate for Joe Biden to take this step and to make this decision because this gentleman, our president, is 81 years old. This is an age at which nearly everyone in their career is seeking retirement and understands the appropriateness of retiring. We can look at some other examples from politics. We can look at the, I think, rather frightening precedent set by Justice Ginsburg, someone who, just like we were saying about Biden, had a very positive legacy in office until it came to her inability to take this step and to make this decision to retire. And we think about what her legacy would have been if she had decided to retire at an appropriate moment, rather than staying in office until her death and handing the Supreme Court over to the Republican president and the Republican Senate. Similarly, if Joe Biden were to decide to do the graceful and dignified thing and retire at the age of 81, he would leave an excellent legacy in office. But instead, he seems committed to continuing on this path, which could lead to disaster. The difference between being the person who beat Trump in 2020 and being the person who lost to Trump in 2024 is pretty massive when it comes to legacy. The other thing is that you were talking about excitement and how I was alluding to the exciting possibilities of a Biden retirement. And I agree with the distinction that you're making there. We're not talking about excitement from the position of spectating on politics as sport. What we're talking about is the energy and excitement that the anti-Trump movement in this country desperately needs and doesn't currently have. When I was watching the debate, something that I noticed was the way that Joe Biden looks, sounds, and feels is practically a personified embodiment of the way the entire anti-Trump movement feels, looks, and sounds right now. And it's age, but it's also that sense of exhaustion. And that is the way that so many people who were so energized to go out and vote and campaign against Trump were the last cycle feel now. It's been 9 years of the same routine, combating the same lies, the same efforts at subversion. The people who were reading coverage of the investigation into Paul Manafort in 2015 and 16, think about the way those people feel now. This sense of absolute exhaustion and lack of energy to continue the fight was manifested in the person of Joe Biden on stage on Thursday night. The way that he looked and felt is exactly the way that so many of us look and feel right now, and the way that that movement at large looks and feels right now. And that should be frightening to all of us. And I was thinking about this also about cause and effect. does Biden look that way and feel that way because we do? Or is it partly also the other way around? If Biden is the figurehead and leader of the campaign against Trump in this election, the way that he looks, sounds, and feels is reflecting back on all of us too. And if there was a younger and more energetic spokesperson for that movement, I think that you would see people in the general public who want to stop Trump feeling a lot more life in that effort. And that's part of why it is exciting to think about what could happen if we did have a fresher, younger, more energetic face leading this fight forward. You were talking about the difference between campaigning and doing the job of president. And I think that that's an important distinction in some ways. But these things are so linked because voters are thinking about how someone is going to do the job when they're deciding how to evaluate a campaign and how to evaluate a candidate. So voters, most of them, I hope and think, aren't idiots. And they understand the pressures that the president is under and the responsibility that that person has. And they see Joe Biden on stage and they don't believe that he's got the aptitude and capacity to carry out those responsibilities at this moment in time. This article that came out in Axios today saying that inside the White House, Biden staff are limiting his working hours to 10 a.m. and 4 p.m., like a 6-hour workday, because they don't think that he's fresh and alert enough at other hours. Well, those of us who are evaluating the president's capacity and aptitude are thinking about all of the things that might happen at 10 p.m. at night, all the things that might happen, as Hillary Clinton famously said in 2008, the phone calls that might come at 3 a.m. and how the president has to be ready to answer and address those phone calls. Analysts of potential nuclear war have said that the president has 6 minutes to decide if the Soviet Union or Russia were to launch a nuclear weapon against the United States. The president has 6 minutes to decide how, when, and where to retaliate. And if Joe Biden is only able to make those decisions between the times of 10 a.m. and 4 p.m., then he's not able to carry out his responsibilities and do the job. And this is what voters are thinking about when they're deciding who they're going to vote for. The last thing that I wanted to say here is something that you kind of alluded to, which is the way that a candidate needs to treat Donald Trump if people are going to understand the urgency and emergency of the threat that he poses. When you've got a candidate on stage who led an attack against the United States Capitol, who's declared his intention to terminate the Constitution, it does require a very forceful rebuke, condemnation, censure. And that is absolutely not what we saw from Joe Biden on Thursday. And the moment in the debate that I will actually mention is one that might seem more superficial, but I think demonstrates this better than anything, which was that moment when they were bantering about their golf handicaps at the end of the debate. Embarrassing, humiliating, and also exactly the opposite of what's really needed. When Donald Trump comes on stage after leading an attack against the United States, the other candidate needs to point to him and say, this person does not deserve to be here. We're not in equal company right now. I'm the president and I'm standing here against someone who, by any practical definition of the word, is a traitor to the United States. What we don't want to see is this fraternal bantering about idle habits. For the public to look at that, what they're seeing is two friendly elites who are engaged in a gentleman's game, who are not in an apocalyptic almost battle for the sake of the future of the country. This is not Obama Romney or Bush Gore. This is a mainstream American president running against someone who seeks to subvert the United States. And Biden did not seem even aware of the stakes when he was carrying on in that manner. And that, I think, was a moment that really demonstrated why he doesn't appear to be up for the job of running this campaign right now.
And I think that that is the main point here, right? He's not able to show a clear difference between himself and Donald Trump with the folks that aren't reading Axios, with the folks that aren't maybe uber focused on January 6th on the Constitution, with the folks that, quite frankly, don't understand or care about policy. What matters to those folks is not substance, it is style. And that is a big thing because President Trump, while he spews all these lies, while he is using dangerous rhetoric, while he is, if you're transcribing what he is saying, incoherent, incomplete sentences, incomplete thoughts, it is forceful and clear words, which unfortunately are way better than what President Biden offers. And people keep using the State of the Union. Yes, I think the State of the Union was better than we have seen from Biden before, but it was still not good. It was still completely not up to what is required during a long and arduous presidential campaign against somebody like Donald Trump, who uses this manic anger to power him and come across as a, strong man that resonates with a lot of folks. And when you have somebody like President Biden, who is more thoughtful, but his thoughts appear and sound jumbled up, it looks even worse in comparison, right? I don't know if Biden would look as bad if the candidate wasn't as forceful and energetic as Trump, even if that energy is, coming from an extremely bad and scary place.
Frankly, Trump does sound incoherent. If you listen to Trump in isolation and you don't compare him to President Biden, if you just listen to the audio of a Trump rally, or even if you just listen to him for some of the night on the debate stage, you would say, frankly, this man sounds like a rambling lunatic, giving speeches praising the fictional character Hannibal Lecter, the serial killer from Silence of the Lambs. But the thing is, the campaign running against Trump needs to be able to make that contrast. So it's not that Trump is doing extraordinarily well. It's that he's running against an opponent who is not in a position to draw a distinction and heighten out these weaknesses that Trump actually does have. So you were talking about that poll that said that 27% of Americans think that Biden currently has the capacity to do the job, and 72% say otherwise. Well, in the same poll, they found that the numbers for Trump are actually pretty bad as well. There are about 50% who said that he doesn't have the capacity to do the job from a position of mental fitness and coherence, and that only 48% or so said that he did. Ordinarily, you would look at those numbers and you would say, these are appalling numbers. Half of the country believe that this candidate doesn't have the mental capacity to do the job. That should be catnip for a campaign running against him. But because Biden's numbers are even worse, we're not able to see that as an advantage. This was a point that was made by Ezra Klein in an article he wrote in February, making some of these same arguments for why Biden should retire. He said that when he mentions Biden's age as a compelling reason for Biden to retire, what he often hears from Democrats is, oh, well, it's okay because Trump's old too. When a candidate has weaknesses, key weaknesses, like the ones that Trump does have when it comes to coherency, age, and the rest, the goal shouldn't be to give him an even match. This is the way Ezra Klein put it. The goal should be to draw a distinction, to use that weakness as an advantage for the other campaign. So I do disagree with you a little bit about Trump's performance. I don't think that his performance was particularly good in this debate or in many other recent appearances. He was fine in the debate, and he's been terrible in a lot of recent appearances. The problem is not that he's doing particularly well. The problem is that the Democrats are currently running a candidate who is so poorly positioned to exacerbate those weaknesses, draw to distinction, and take advantage of them.
Maybe I misspoke or wasn't clear. I don't think Trump is great objectively. I think that his style of bombast and energetic anger compares extremely favorably to the style of President Biden, which comes across as meek, incoherent, and at times just freezing and unable to get words out. Yeah, Trump may tell people to inject bleach, but words are going to come out of his mouth. And largely when it's voters that matter who are uninformed about policy, who do not care about policy, and you have somebody who comes out and is at least able to speak versus somebody who is not able to speak, and that person is speaking with force, that lends itself to be perceived as somebody that would be potentially more fit for the job. So I would say that a lot of voters will come out of that debate thinking that Trump is more capable of doing the job. Let's get into what folks have been saying in the media and how the Democratic Party has been handling this. And then we'll get into where we go from here, because quite frankly, we understand, again, the strongest argument aside from, oh, President Biden is capable of doing the job. Just look at his legislative record. The strongest argument against replacing President Biden is that the alternative is worse, which I think we both disagree with. But let's get into the response. I think largely, John, we got here because of both the Biden campaign trying to openly silence voices like Ezra Klein, Nate Silver, and others who were calling for President Biden to drop out at the end of the winter and in February. And quite frankly, I was one of those people that were saying, okay, calling for President Biden to drop out is unrealistic. It doesn't make sense. This is just people trying to get clicks. So I need to do a mea culpa in that I was wrong, because I just didn't understand that President Biden had deteriorated to this level. So I blame the campaign staff. Also, I blame MSNBC. And MSNBC, while they are not as dangerous to the country as Fox News, which is pushing great replacement theory and a lot of dangerous and harmful GOP policy positions. They've been trafficking in pro-Russia talking points, and we don't need to go through it all. But the similarities between MSNBC and Fox News are this. Fox News, from my experience in the Republican Party, is the propaganda arm of the RNC, the Trump campaign, as MSNBC is the propaganda arm of the Biden campaign and the DNC. All that we need to do, we don't need to look at Rachel Maddow, who just justifies the administration. Let's look at who they employ, John. They employ Simone Sanders, who was a Biden communications person. And one of their primetime hosts is Jen Psaki, the former press secretary of the Biden White House. Not only are they, cozying up to the Biden administration, they're literally hiring the mouth and face of this administration, because as we know, as we've been critical on this program, the Biden communication staff has been hiding the president. So if the president has been hidden for 3.5 years, largely, has not been doing interviews, then the face of that organization naturally is the people that are doing those interviews and now they're all on MSNBC. So MSNBC reacted for years, actually, during the president's first term, in just outright silencing these voices, condemning them, and attacking them for being not Democrats. And by doing so, what it did is it provided a lot of cover for congressional Democrats to not truly analyze what is going on, to not review the down ballot effects with the same vigor that they might. So I do blame them for that. However, after the debate, I was extremely impressed with how Chris Hayes and the other reporters on MSNBC approached this issue. It was largely sober and accurate. And my takeaway was, wow, President Biden needs to step down. Morning Joe, the morning of, Joe Scarborough gave this long monologue saying how much he loves President Biden, how great he did with this legislative agenda, kind of like we did to start this show. But he said he needs to step down for the betterment of the party. The New York Times editorial board came out saying President Biden needs to step down. Tom Friedman, a personal friend of President Biden, came out saying he needs to step down. In CNN, there was an article from Joe Biden's former babysitter that said he needed to come out and step down for the betterment of the country.
Wait, Justin, was this person a babysitter to Joe Biden's children or a babysitter to Joe Biden himself? Because that would make this person quite old. I'm trying to imagine what a babysitter to Joe Biden would be like today. Someone from who babysit President Biden in the 1940s.
It's his old neighbor from Scranton, and this neighbor's mother was Joe Biden's babysitter. But I'm not running for president, so I can mix up my words.
You don't have to answer the 3 a.m. phone call, Justin, like the president does.
Thankfully, I don't. The Pod Save America people came out. The Bulwark podcasters and opinion writers came out saying Biden needs to step down. The campaign's response was to malign them as self-promotional podcasters coming out to make a name for themselves and get clicks. And my point is here, it's not self-promotional podcasters. It's nearly everybody that is self-respecting in the media that leans left, that doesn't believe that they should go out there and gaslight, lie, ruin their own credibility. And it is full of people that legitimately care for President Biden. So I would say we got into this largely because the liberal media looked the other way and attacked folks following the guidance of the campaign and Jen Psaki and MSNBC hosts. But now the response has been extraordinarily healthy.
I don't think that the problem is the media. I think the media have come almost to a consensus that it's time for President Biden to retire. And this is something that even before the Thursday debate was a point of contention between Biden and his apparatus and the mainstream media at large. The New York Times spent a lot of time talking about Biden's age as a problem. The Ezra Klein piece that I mentioned is just one example of that. But we talked about this actually with our recent guest, Terry McGowan, how the Democratic Party apparatchiks have spent so much time this election cycle complaining about the media coverage of President Biden. And the biggest point of complaint, the most common point of complaint, is that the media are spending too much time talking about President Biden's age. The New York Times being a particular focus of consternation in this regard. Well, after the Thursday debate, I think that we all owe a big apology to the media and the New York Times in particular, because I think that their coverage has been vindicated by what we saw on Thursday. And now, almost across the board, the mainstream media are coming with quite a bit of pressure on the White House. What I'm seeing is a siege mentality inside the White House of Biden, of his closest personal aides, in denial about what the general public are seeing and what the media are expressing on behalf of the public. And it reminds me of Trump. It reminds me of the MAGA movement and the people around Trump who spend so much energy trying to convince themselves, let alone the general public, against things that are obvious. Who do you believe, me or your lying eyes? And the general public, in poll after poll and focus group after focus group, have been saying that they think that Biden is too old to run for re-election. The media are reporting this. And the White House want us all to deny that this is a problem. And that's a problem. And it reminds me of MAGA.
The debate feeds an endless amount of clips. So Twitter, YouTube, Instagram Live, Facebook, but also TikTok. And we had a discussion with Terry McGowan about how TikTok clips and all of these clips are going to be vital for influencing these young voters that have been moving away from Biden. So this debate makes that much more difficult. And it's quite frankly, probably some of the only political material they've been seeing last week. So that's those voters. Your point about the Biden campaign response mirroring MAGA and the gaslighting, I think that that is a major net negative on those Nikki Haley swing voters, or those voters that voted for Donald Trump in 2020, but the insurrection and the felony conviction really turned them off. So you mentioned the gaslighting. The gaslighting is when there's a clip of President Biden and he's incoherent or stumbling and mumbling. The Biden team in the White House, the campaign would immediately say, oh, it's edited. Joe Biden's fine. He's completely coherent. There's nothing wrong. Maybe a clip or two had been edited, but it's abundantly clear that this is how he is a lot of the time, not all the time, but a lot of the time. So it's very obvious to everybody that these Democratic surrogates and talking heads, because of the information they were getting fed to them by the campaign and a lack of ability to critically analyze what was going on, were lying to them. And that is MAGA tenet 101. Number two, they attack the media. You had mentioned this already. We discussed it with Terry McGowan. But attacking the media, the enemy of the people, as Trump coined them, is another aspect of Trumpism and MAGAism that turns off these self-respecting, maybe more higher in info, more higher involved political Republicans that voted in primaries and were shifting away from Donald Trump towards Joe Biden. Additionally, what they're seeing is when Democratic surrogates, like everybody that we just named, the Pod Save America folks, Bulwark, everybody else, comes out saying Biden should retire, the Biden campaign releases a memo calling them self-serving podcasters, when it's a lot of highly educated journalists with integrity like a Sted Herndon at the New York Times and others. Not only that, but after Donald Trump's felony conviction, and I'm not comparing a presidential candidate and current president who is incompetent to run in an election to somebody committing felonies and being convicted for felonies, but after Donald Trump was convicted of felonies, what did MAGA and Trump say? They said two things. Number one, this will help us in the polls. And number two, look at our fundraising numbers. Okay. So number one, President Biden in North Carolina immediately gets on stage, gives a speech, and part of his speech is citing one poll showing he actually gained voters. That is out of the Trump playbook. Number two, on Sunday morning, President Biden's campaign team released their historic fundraising numbers. It was $33 million raised after the debate, with 26 million of that coming from small donors and 50% of that 26 million coming from first-time donors this cycle. They are using the exact same playbook that MAGA used to justify a legitimate existential campaign crisis, because this is all that they have at their disposal. The truth is not on their side, and this is a legitimate existential campaign crisis. So if you're a Nikki Haley voter and you don't think President Biden is competent enough to continue doing the job based on what your eyes have told you, and then you see the way that the campaign staff and President Biden is now prosecuting the argument that he should remain in the race, and it's not based on fact and truth and the merits of the argument. Instead, it's based on that ad hominem personal attack, degrading the Fourth Estate and the media. It really jumbles it if your natural policy predilection is maybe you're pro-life. Maybe you do agree with President Trump, former President Trump, on immigration more so than President Biden. Maybe you do like the extreme pro-police and crime rhetoric that President Trump is using. And the only thing that was pushing you over to either go for President Biden or stay home was the fact that you believed he was competent enough to defend democracy, along with having enough integrity to not tear down all of our institutions around us. I think that makes the argument a lot less persuasive for these voters and is another reason why this is so problematic.
Yeah, Justin, I mean, you mentioned a bunch of things there that I kind of want to comment on. I mean, the first thing, then the most recent point you made there is about talking about donations as a sign that the Biden campaign have lots of strength and support from the general public. I think this is ridiculous. It's so pathetic. And it is something that the Republicans do all the time. And what does a flurry of donations after a moment like this really reflect? What it reflects is panic from partisans, right? And that's why Donald Trump is getting fundraising after he's convicted of a felony, because the hardcore, very committed, very loyal partisan base are saying, oh my God, our candidate is losing. I have to give him money to help him make up that ground. That's what it's showing. It's really showing the exact opposite of what they're claiming that it represents.
And John, I donated to President Biden before the debate. If I hadn't, I would have after the debate, because I did so out of abject panic.
I mean, I got some really funny fundraising texts from the Biden campaign right around the time of the debate. I got a message that says, this is an SMS. I got in a direct text message for the first time this cycle. I got a message that says, Democrats, is there anything we can say to convince you to make a contribution to the DNC? And anything in all caps. I'm thinking like, this is so incredibly desperate sounding. I mean, is there anything we can say to convince you to make a contribution? Anyway, you also mentioned Ested, and I'm glad that you mentioned him. That was one of our best previous episodes. Everyone who's listening to this, you should go and listen to that one. Number one, it's focused on Kamala Harris and how she performs as a candidate and what she looks like as a candidate. So we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves here, but maybe it's a preview of what could happen if she ended up becoming the nominee. So people should check that out. But also, just like Ezra Klein, he's another reporter at the New York Times who deserves a lot of credit because of the way that he's approaching this question all the way up until Thursday's debate, focusing on the issue of President Biden's age as a liability, which it was and which other people wanted to deny. But if you're out there and talking to voters, as Ested so often does, you're hearing again and again and again as a major concern. And I'm sure that anyone listening to this who's been talking to other people who aren't hardcore committed Democratic partisans, you're hearing the same thing too. You were talking also about the clips circulating online and how those can be so influential at shaping the perception of candidates. And, you know, what's interesting is that in the run up to the debate, I think the week before the debate, there had been all these stories about how many of these clips are distortive, that they've selectively edited information out of the clip to make Biden look more incompetent than he did. And this was something that the Democrats had been telling themselves to comfort them, that this information was false and misleading. So a couple things about that. The first thing that I want to say is that the fact that these clips are being distortive and are taking information out of context, that reflects more badly on Republicans than it should offer comfort to Democrats. There is this very strange dynamic in the Trump era where the Republicans and Trump and his backers are lying when they don't need to, because it's become second nature to them to lie about everything. And it's just become kind of pathological. The Republicans don't need to lie about this. They've chosen to do so. And yes, many of those clips are misleading. They're doing that because they're addicted to lying. You don't need to lie to recognize this as a problem for Biden. If you watch the debate on Thursday, there's no selective editing. It's broadcast live. It's not being taken out of context. You can go and see with your own eyes and tell me whether you think it's a problem or not. And forget about the clips that have been distorted. Who cares? It's a real problem. It's a real problem. And both true clips and fake clips are going to be circulating, and both of those are going to damage Biden's candidacy. And the last thing that I kind of wanted to mention here, you referenced the Pod Save America guys and what they were saying. So I think that this is an important window into the problem. David Plouffe, who is one of the hosts of this program, this Pod Save America program, former Obama staffer, was the person who was dispatched by Obama to go and convince Biden not to run in 2016 and to tell him, Vice President Biden, you've had a great legacy. It's time to retire. Clinton's going to win. She's going to beat the Republican. That's the best thing for the party. It's time to go. You're too old. You got to quit. And Biden listened to that advice, didn't run in 2016, watched Clinton lose against Donald Trump, and came back in 2020 and said, these young Obama staffers who were sent out to tell me to retire were wrong, and I was right, and I'm never going to listen to them again, and I'm always going to be counted out, and they're always going to be wrong. These young staffers, they think they know better, but they don't understand my appeal. And this is the baggage that has helped create the situation we're in now, where Biden really does need to retire, but he's not going to listen to that advice because in his head, he's heard it all before, and they were wrong.
When the 2020 season was kicking off, there were reports that President Obama himself told Joe Biden that he shouldn't go again. And if he didn't tell him directly, it was conversations through donors that President Obama favored Elizabeth Warren over his former VP at the time. And Elizabeth Warren did horrendous in the primary. She was never a viable candidate. Even though a lot of our listeners probably really like her, and there's nothing wrong with really liking her. Again, a competent legislator and somebody that is brilliant and a former professor at Harvard, that has nothing to do with campaigning for president of the United States. Let's be honest.
We all know the story of the boy who cried wolf, right? So the boy was wrong the first 2 times. He said there was a wolf and there was no wolf. And then the villagers didn't believe him when he was telling the truth. Well, isn't that sort of what's happening now? Biden, he said, I heard you before. You told me I was too old and I couldn't win in 2016. You were wrong. You told me I was too old and I couldn't win in 2020. You were wrong again. Why should I listen to you now? Well, the third time, there was a wolf. And this time, there's a wolf.
If you look at the polling now, compare it to what was pre-debate and compare it to what was 4 years ago, it's just not even on the same planet, Anderson. If you ask voters now, does Biden have the mental fitness, in fact, to be president, those numbers are incredibly low. The percentage who say he does not have the mental fitness, look at this, 72% say he does not have the mental fitness in order to be president right now. That's up from 65% pre-debate. But compare that to 4 years ago, the percentage of voters who said that Biden was too old. It was just 36%. That's half the level that we're looking at right now. These numbers are not anywhere close to being the same. 4 years ago, voters for the most part thought Joe Biden was with it. He could handle the job as president. You look at those numbers now, the fact is voters do not even see them on the same planet. They don't think Biden's with it. They do not believe he has the mental fitness to be president. And I have to be honest with you, I don't know how he wins with the numbers that we see right now.
So one of the reasons why I personally left the Republican Party, aside from the xenophobia, Trump bragging on tape of, sexually harassing or raping women, the Hollywood Access tape, grabbing them by the pussy was the quote, sorry. But it was that the Democratic Party truly cares about democracy, and they don't have a collective action problem like the Republicans do. We had discussed this with Charles C.W. Cook in 2020 when it looked like Bernie Sanders had the advantage and Joe Biden needed South Carolina. After he got South Carolina, I believe Warren, Klobuchar, Buttigieg all dropped out in quick succession. So there has been a streak of the Democrats in campaigns to put the best of the party forward, though, John. It's been that way with legislators, too, which is astounding. Former Speaker Pelosi, Leader Hoyer, Steny Hoyer, Whip Jim Clyburn, historic legislators who I would argue you could put up there with any legislators throughout our history as evidenced by Biden's successful first term. What did they do? It took them a while, like I'm sure you will point out. And hopefully it's foreshadowing what we will experience with President Biden. But they all stepped aside willingly. They could still do this job. They'd be effective at it, but they're like, our country is at a tipping point. It is imperative that we face this next challenge against President Trump with new leadership. We are going to step aside in 2022 when Joe Biden should have made the announcement on about not running again. And we're going to help that next generation. We are going to mentor them and position them to rise to this challenge because they are most capable in facing it. Unfortunately, leaders in the party, President Obama, in former electeds, President Clinton, Speaker Pelosi, who's still an elected official, Jim Clyburn, have all come out saying President Biden is our nominee, and they have endorsed him. Let's go back to 2016. I experienced very similarly what I assume the DNC and Biden campaign is going through when I was working for the RNC. It was in October, though. So it was much later in the cycle. It was post-convention. There would have been a whole host of issues and negative consequences had Trump dropped out. But what happened was the Hollywood Access tape drops. Trump is on tape bragging about sexual assault, and it is absolutely abhorrent. It is disgusting. The Speaker of the House at the time, Paul Ryan, distanced himself from President Trump immediately. There was extreme pushback and consideration for replacing him on the ticket. Furthermore, the RNC, along with leaders of the Republican Party, flew to New York to try and lobby President Trump to drop out, to the point where the higher-ups at the RNC were conveying to us at the time that it was a legitimate possibility that President Trump would drop out for the betterment of the party because this event had damaged him irreparably, right? We had a bunch of October surprises and Trump ended up winning. But that is to say that the way that the DNC and Jamie Harrison, who came out with these fundraising numbers and full-throated support for President Biden, the way that former Speaker Pelosi, a lot of prominent former and prominent current elected Democrats have approached this is with less integrity than the Republican Party approached an existential crisis in a campaign in October before the election. We're not comparing the Hollywood Access tape to an incompetent campaigner, right? These are two different things. However, where they are similar is they will both have a massive impact on the election. A massive, maybe that's 0.1% of voters. Maybe that's 0.5%. Maybe it's more. But in an election that will be determined potentially by 60,000 voters across 6 or 7 states, that 0.1%, that 0.5% is massive. Every vote matters. And I think it just goes back to the first point we're making, John, that when you are making the argument that you are the selfless candidate and selfless party that is putting the democracy first, how can you seriously make that argument when just 8 years ago, the Republicans were acting with more integrity than the Democrats are now?
Yeah, I mean, just like you said, we're not comparing the exact reason why there needs to be an intervention here as if they're morally similar. You know, we're not saying that committing crimes and assaulting and abusing people is the same thing from a moral standpoint as, you know, being too old. Being old is not a crime. There's nothing morally wrong with being old. But President Biden appears to be in a position where, number one, he might not be able to competently carry out his duties as president. And number two, he does not appear at all to be able to effectively campaign for the office. And what it is in both cases, in the case of Trump and in the case of Biden, for very different reasons, is a test of whether the office is bigger than the man to the people around the president or the candidate, to the political party as an institution, right? When we're in a position where the man does not seem to be fit or suited for the office, who do you choose, the office or the man? And I think that the Republican Party today, with Trump, who they must surely know is not fit, are clearly choosing the man above the office. And our concern is that the Democrats are doing the same thing right now. Now, you're talking about 2016 as a point of distinction between the two. We wouldn't make that claim today with the Republican Party fully in line behind Trump. But if we're talking about the way Speaker Ryan approached that event and the way that Nancy Pelosi, President Obama, and others are approaching this event, I see the distinction that you're making. Again, wouldn't make that distinction today. But what we're seeing are two parties who are putting, it appears, right now, the man above the office. And what do you call that? What's a word for that? It's a cult of personality. And it seems strange to think that there could be a cult of personality around President Biden. But at the same time, how else would you describe this institutional situation where they're so stuck defending someone as if it matters more to defend him personally than to compete as hard as you possibly can to win the office of the presidency? And I think that that's pretty concerning.
You do have to add a caveat. After the debate, Democrats were asked by reporters on Capitol Hill for their responses. A lot of them rallied the wagons. One that did not was Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries, who basically said, we will see the vision that President Biden lays out in a speech in North Carolina and move forward from there. It was not a full-throated endorsement. Additionally, Axios came out with a story leaked by Senate Majority Leader Charles Schumer's closest allies, saying that before the debate, Senator Schumer had a discussion about if the debate did not go well, maybe there should be consideration to replacing President Biden at the top of the ticket. He needed to telegraph that to allies to begin that process. And additionally, Rep. Jamie Raskin was quoted to MSNBC saying there was a big problem with Biden's debate performance, and there are very honest, serious, and rigorous conversations taking place, while contrasting it with the response from the GOP after Trump got convicted as a felon.
I think that that's really interesting, Justin, these examples that you've brought up, especially the examples of Jeffries and Schumer, because I think that the position that they're in maybe has helped them develop a different perspective than some of this institutional malaise that you've seen from their seniors. So you were talking about how Pelosi had retired at the right time and had gracefully passed the baton on to the next generation of leadership. Well, for the people who were waiting to take over, it didn't seem that way. A lot of them thought that Pelosi was hanging on forever and would never go, even when they lost election after election after election after election for the House. There was a lot of calls on Pelosi to retire and hand the baton over much earlier than she actually did. In fact, we even had Seth Moulton, a congressional Democrat, on our program called Pelosi a dictator for refusing to do this.
Just so we don't mischaracterize, he said something along the lines, very close, we're paraphrasing, that she rules with a dictatorial zeal or a dictatorial fist, and maybe that's what we need. And mind you, context, he is somebody that previously challenged the speaker.
Well, my memory of that exchange was that he said that she was showing dictatorial tendencies by not allowing younger members to take over as committee chairman. And this was a complaint that we heard a lot about Pelosi's time as speaker, is that she stayed on for too long, and so did many of her subordinates as committee chairman. There was an obsession with seniority, and there wasn't the recognition of the need to pass the baton on to the next generation. And so someone like Jeffries, who admires and has such a close relationship a trusting relationship with Pelosi, he still lived through this. And he was still waiting very patiently to be able to take over the leadership position for quite a long time. And I think that perhaps for him, he's looking at this situation with President Biden, maybe with a little bit of empathy towards the people who might be in a position to replace him as the presidential nominee, because he has had this experience of waiting for someone in their 80s to hand over leadership at a time when it seems clearly necessary to do so. And that person perhaps taking a lot longer than they should to come to that conclusion.
I would just like to add, we are in July. The election is in November, and the most important things typically happen late September, early October. We can go through WikiLeaks. We can go through James Comer and the BS that he pulled. We can go through Hillary Clinton fainting at an event in New York because of the heat and getting carried into a van, which stoked all of these different conspiracies. That all happened in September, October. The job of president is very difficult. It is very taxing, and it ages everybody exponentially, right? Everybody's seen pictures of George W. Bush side to side, before and after, President Obama side to side, before and after. So President Biden has a few more months of being president, with the war in the Middle East, with the war in Ukraine, with stubborn inflation, with an immigration problem, with real serious policy challenges that he needs to address, which will continue to wear him down. He is going to have to speak at some point, and he is going to need to be out there campaigning, and he is not going to be perfect. And as he's out on the campaign trail more and more and more, he's going to get more and more and more fatigued. So that, you would assume and think logically, would likely deteriorate his ability to function. Additionally, it gets really hot, John, in these swing states, in Georgia, in North Carolina, in parts of Pennsylvania, in the upper Midwest during the summer where he's going to be campaigning. Hillary Clinton was in far better shape, age-wise, mentally, than President Biden was in 2020. In 2016, she was competent, and she still had a health issue on the campaign trail. This is likely to happen again, and this could be part of the October surprise. So while the debate performance, conceivably, there is a logical argument that it did not truly existentially damage Biden because voters have already built this in. If this continues to happen, I cannot imagine that it will not resonate and break through and hurt Biden, even if it hasn't at this point. So we're not saying that the debate is a seminal moment for the debate's sake. We are saying that the debate really hurt and is probably something he can't recover from because he's incapable of having a sustained and improved performance that will assuage all fears. Do you want to add anything before we go to what's next and why this sucks and there are terrible options, but they're still better than what we're currently facing?
Yeah, I mean, I would just say that, kind of to your point, we could be accused of being too reactive to make all of these comments right after the debate, just a couple days later. But again, I would say that what we're responding to isn't just Thursday. It's so many other warning signs that we've been seeing. And honestly, from the perspective of our program, at least, not really commenting on, for example, the lack of press conferences, for example, how infrequently Biden communication staff have put him forward for major interviews. All of the comments that have been coming in focus groups and polls about Biden's age from ordinary voters, the ones that were picked up by people like Asted and Ezra Klein that we were talking about. This is not sudden news that we're responding to in an exaggerated way. It's a reflection of the long, slow buildup for what is obviously the clear liability of this campaign.
Do need to say I apologize to the communications team in the White House for the fact that they should have been hiding President Biden. He's not capable of doing a tough interview. He's not capable of being out there. I thought he was because they were hiding him. So in a way, while they were hurting the country by doing that, while they were imperiling democracy by doing that, if your job is to protect the principal and the elected official, I guess you could make the argument that they were doing it right. So the last criticism here, we've heard criticisms that it's too late to replace him and that the alternatives are not good. So let's just get into that. What would the process look like? If Biden were to drop out, he would release his delegates and Ultimately, there would be an open floor fight in Chicago to determine who the next nominee is. And as everybody that's a listener to this program, you're highly educated, you're following this stuff, you understand that the president is the nominee is ultimately selected at the convention, even though there's a primary process that's controlled by the party. So it's nothing untoward that would happen.
Just before we dive into it, I think it's very nice that you say that everyone who's listening to this program is highly educated. I like that idea that our audiences are all have PhDs. I want to respond to what I think is probably the single most common thing you hear from people who are afraid of a new nominee, which is that there's not enough time for another nominee to be selected and to campaign effectively against Trump. This is probably the most common explanation you hear for people who want to just do nothing and stay the course. And I think that this is frankly a ridiculous claim when you really think about it, because the election is in November and we are recording this program at the end of June. That's a lot of time. July, August, September, October, November. We're talking about 5 months away. That should be plenty of time for a candidate to campaign. And just like you said, Justin, the candidates are never officially selected until August. When you look at international comparisons to the way the US election system works, I think this should become even more obvious. So let me give a couple examples. In the UK, when they have an election, they announce the election 25 days before the election is held. And those 25 days, they have to select all of their candidates and they run their entire campaigns and then they vote. And they can do it all in 6 weeks. In France, the amount of time is actually even less than in the UK. So in France, they announced that they're going to have a national legislative election on June 9th. They're going to have their first round of voting on June 30th. We're talking about 21 days to select all of their candidates for all the parties and for all the campaigning to happen and for voters to go out and vote. That June 30th election, it's happening today, actually, as we record. That's the first round. It's like a primary. The second round, the runoff, is 7 days later. They are selecting the final candidates on June 30th, and they're voting on those candidates on July 7th. That is 7 days. And we're saying that 5 months is not enough time for a candidate to be selected and for that candidate to campaign. It's completely preposterous. We've gotten so used in the United States to this idea that a campaign has to drag on for years. We've got candidates announcing their primary runs sometimes as early as January of the year before the presidential election. It's a 2-year-long campaign. I don't think the voters are benefiting from this. I don't think the parties are benefiting from this. I think it's a waste of time to spend that much time campaigning. I think it hurts the legislative schedule. I think that much less is achieved because the congressional candidates go into campaign mode so early and leave so little time to actually focus on the big ticket legislative items. No one is benefiting from this mindset. It's totally absurd. The other thing is that Donald Trump has such high name ID that it should not really take very long for a campaign to define him and to promote their own candidate against him. So much of the work is already done. It's been 9 years of him running for office. We know what we're up against, and those points can certainly be made in 5 months.
And everything we've said about Biden can be transferred to Trump, right? About his inability to do the job, the concerns about his mental acuity, and that's where the focus should be. So I'd just say that President Trump is defined already. The negative ads are already writing themselves, ready to be released. The next thing about the time that I would add is overarching campaign theory is 2 to 4 weeks out is when these swing voters start to truly pay attention. If you were to replace Joe Biden by August 22nd or August 19th, the dates of the convention start and end, regardless of who was chosen to replace President Biden, you would have what we started out this discussion with. You would have a massive energizing moment, not for the pundit class, John, but for the country in a lot of ways, because the country has been critical of the fact that we have to have an election between these two candidates that quote unquote nobody wants. So when Joe Biden steps down, and he does so in a way that says, I am listening to the country, I have accomplished what I have set out to accomplish. There are better alternatives to continue my mission personally and to continue the mission of the Democratic Party and protect our country. It is insert your candidate. Let's just say it is. I support VP Harris. Whoever is chosen, what's going to happen is the wagons will circle. We've discussed that the Biden campaign and the, most ardent Midas touching super PACs are all out there attacking people and circling the wagons. You're going to have MSNBC, you're going to have CNN, the Washington Post, the New York Times, all these people that we said were critical of President Biden's chances now. You're going to have them circle the wagons and support whoever the nominee is unequivocally. We are going to walk over broken glass to support that person. I've been critical of Kamala Harris on the Vice President Kamala Harris on this program. I would do anything to help elect her. I will donate to the campaign if she's at the top of it. That is to say, the perfect will not be the enemy of the good. Democrats will rally. They will have 10 weeks to then make that argument to the rest of the base voters, and also those last 4 weeks that really matter to the undecideds. So that is just to put some context.
What we're hearing from Democrats is if we have a brokered convention and we open up competition between potential nominees, we won't have unity in the party. Well, look at what we've been witnessing for the last year or two, the last several years. The problem I am worried about is not a lack of unity. It's the opposite. It's excessive unity, excessive discipline. The way that all of the Democrats in major public offices have aligned behind President Biden when it was not a wise choice to do so. Look at that level of unity and discipline, and you can come to the conclusion that the problem is not a lack of unity and discipline. It's the opposite. And so I am not concerned that, just like you say, there's not going to be unification and discipline around a different nominee.
And John, it will be messy. And I do think that this has a 50% or greater chance of happening. President Biden will withdraw, retire, however you want to frame it. He'll make it sound like it was of his own volition. He'll make it sound like he was listening to the voters, and he's doing this for the betterment of the country. Then what will happen is this very, very, very messy floor fight for delegates. You will get criticisms that it was a closed room, back room deal like the Clinton did against Bernie Sanders in 2016. You will have people that are very upset. You will have Democrats that cannot stand Kamala Harris for a variety of reasons, whether it be policy or just the fact that she's a Black woman. How will the delegates be chosen? The delegates will be chosen by those that have the most institutional power within the Democratic Party. So you would assume that President Biden will tell delegates, you are free to vote for whoever you want, but I support my Vice President, Kamala Harris. Additionally, Kamala Harris has been Vice President, so she is at the top. And she has an ally in Jamie Harrison, who is very close with Whip Clyburn, who Whip Clyburn chose VP Harris. So you have everything aligned for Harris, even though I think there are other stronger candidates, which we can maybe discuss. I think that additionally, maybe the strongest component of the base of the Democratic Party is the Black female voter. We can look at the work that Stacey Abrams did to register folks in Georgia. We can look at the turnout rate. We can look at how this core demographic is largely staying with the Democratic Party, when not all Black voters are staying with the Democratic Party, according to polls. So that is to say, from my perspective, I think it has to be VP Harris, and I am totally fine with that. The only thing that I would say is this: I really want a big boy summer. I really want Governor Pritzker out there being the nominee, all 450 pounds. Maybe I'm being a little facetious, but he's like a 6'4" big boy, like 400 pounds, who has a booming voice, who's charismatic, who speaks in plain English, despite being a multi-billionaire, who goes out on the campaign trail. He watches football. He chugs beers like in a sip. And that would be who I choose, but I'm fine with Harris, John.
I think what you allude to a little bit there, Justin, is that the Democrats are afraid of having, as you described it, a messy convention. They're afraid of having a competitive candidate selection process here. But guess what? Democracies are supposed to be competitive. They're going to be a little bit messy. And the Democrats shouldn't be so afraid of that. In fact, it makes a rather nice contrast to what's been happening with the Republicans. We also hear from Democrats that, Biden won the primaries, and that shows that everyone's united behind him among the general voting public who lean Democratic. And I think that that's misleading because Biden didn't get a serious primary challenger. He got a Steve Schmidt project to extract some money from a completely unknown congressional candidate named Dean Phillips. That doesn't count. He wasn't challenged by someone like Newsom, Harris, or Whitmer, who are the three names that we most often hear as potential nominees beyond Biden. Democrats didn't want a competitive primary process, and they are still afraid of a competitive convention because they are looking at these historical examples. So in 1992, George Bush was challenged in the primary by Pat Buchanan, and it weakened Bush in the general election. He lost to Clinton. After being challenged in the primary, he lost to Clinton, right? In 1980, Jimmy Carter was challenged in the primary by Teddy Kennedy. Carter ended up being the nominee and then lost the general election to Ronald Reagan. In 1976, Gerald Ford was challenged in the primary by Ronald Reagan. He still became the nominee, and he ran and lost to Jimmy Carter. In 1968, Lyndon Johnson was challenged in the primary by a number of other candidates. He ended up dropping out of the race. They had to pick a new nominee, and then that nominee lost in the general election. So there's this pattern that the Democrats are seeing that they're afraid of, that, if there's a serious primary challenge to an incumbent president, it weakens that president, but they still get the nomination because of their institutional power, and then they lose in the general. That's the pattern. That's the pattern. That's the pattern. And this is what they're so afraid of. But anyone who's a statistician will tell you that this is not strong logical methodology. You're looking at like 4 cases and you're saying this is what happens every time. But guess what? 4 times doesn't mean a lot. It's barely a pattern, let alone a prediction of what's guaranteed to occur. This is a small sample size. And the one in particular that they're most afraid of now that we're talking about Biden actually retiring in the middle of a campaign is the one time that has ever happened before. And that's in 1968, like I said, when Lyndon Baines Johnson decided to retire from politics in March in the middle of his re-election campaign. The candidate Hubert Humphrey was then selected at a contested convention, which was also held in Chicago, which was also held at a time when students were protesting actively against an ongoing war, which was also held at a time that the Republican nominee was someone who had previously run for president and lost in a general election. Democrats are so afraid that this exact scenario is going to be repeated again. But guess what? Because something happened once doesn't mean that it's going to happen exactly the same way again. That's probably a more logical thing to assume than to think that something different might end up occurring. So I think that Democrats have become prisoners of this kind of way of thinking, and they're afraid of possibilities. They're afraid to take any kind of risk here. But the risk could be so rewarding because we could end up with a candidate who is able to energize the electorate in a way that Biden has not done so far. Where's the campaign, Justin? Have you been seeing the Biden campaign? Have you been hearing their promises for what they would want to do with another term? Have you been seeing among your friends, among the people in the general public, a lot of enthusiasm for his candidacy? I certainly haven't been seeing that, and it's making me very concerned about what's going to happen. But I think that another nominee could very well bring that to the table in a way that's really beneficial for Democrats. But they're afraid to think about those possibilities because they've become prisoners of these past examples.
And the thing that I'll end on here is Biden could certainly win. And we will probably receive criticism, or folks will roll their eyes thinking, oh, John and Justin, just two elites in Boston and Washington, D.C. We're in a bubble and we're insulated and we're looking at this from the talking class perspective. But I'm not from D.C. I've lived in North Carolina, grew up in New Hampshire, and have a lot of friends from across the political and class spectrum. every one of them has been expressing concern about the debate and saying we are going to lose. These people can include low info voters. These people include high info voters. And I think for both of us, John, we can say that we understand and do value the risks of replacing a candidate at this time in the cycle. But there just is no better alternative from our perspective. So I sincerely hope that if Biden doesn't resign from running again, that he will be able to right the ship and win the election. I'm just not confident.
What I hear from every single ordinary voter is, why do we have these two nominees again? Why can't someone give us another option from the major parties? So many people are saying this. Can you imagine the goodwill that the Democrats, or frankly, the Republicans, could get by being the party, by being the campaign that says, we listened, we heard you, we're going to give you a different choice? Can you imagine when the general sentiment of the public is, we want another choice? Can you imagine the goodwill that a party and a campaign could receive from being the one to do it and saying, we listened, we heard you, we're giving you another choice, and the other team refuses to do so? That's the position that either party can put themselves in if they have the courage to think a little bit broader about what's possible.